Hey everyone, today we're going to take a look at the effects of imperialism in China and China's relations with other countries. By the time we're done, you should be able to explain why China was a bit vulnerable to foreign influence, describe and explain the effects of various wars and rebellions within China, including, in this video, the Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion, the Sino-Japanese War. By the way, Sino is a prefix that means Chinese. So if you ever see that, it's something referring to something Chinese in nature. And the Boxer Rebellion. Also be able to explain how society changed as a result of foreign influence and what effect it ended up having on the government as well. And be able to define these terms, the Qin dynasty, extraterritoriality, spheres of influence, and Sun Yat-sen. So before about the 1700s, before industrialization picked up in earnest anywhere in the world, China was incredibly wealthy because of trade. They didn't import much of anything. China was not industrial, so they didn't really have any need for Western manufactured goods. They were very traditional in nature, and so they made everything internally, really. But China had a lot of stuff that other people wanted, things like spices and silks, those things that had been traded on the Silk Road going back, centuries. But since China didn't want anything Western, they demanded payment for the silks and the spices in silver. And so they were just raking in silver from European countries in exchange for their goods and got incredibly rich as a result of it. But as industrialization picked up and other countries began to be able to manufacture the things that China was famous for trading, China was not able to keep up. So as a result, foreign influence in China is going to begin to become bigger as trade is forced to increase within China. The first major war that China is involved in with the West is the Opium War. The British had begun trading with the Chinese in the early 1800s, really in earnest. And one of the main things they traded was opium, which is a highly addictive drug, primarily grown in places like India. And the British essentially got the Chinese hooked on opium. And this upset the Chinese government, the Qin dynasty, because they didn't want to have to trade with Great Britain. And the Chinese were demanding this good. So China embarked on what was essentially an anti-drug campaign and tried to stop and eventually, by law, banned the import of opium. And Great Britain was not too happy about having their trade cut off with China, so they went to war. And it was a pretty short war, and Britain, with its superior firepower and better ships, very easily overtook China and forced them into the Treaty of Nanjing, which gave the British very, very broad sweeping powers within China to trade and to control certain ports and territories. You may be familiar with the Chinese area of Hong Kong, which from 1842 until 1997 was actually controlled by Great Britain. This also led to something called extraterritoriality. That's where foreigners in a country don't have to abide by the laws of the place where they are. So you have a lot of British citizens living in China who don't have to follow Chinese laws. So they're almost exempt. And that angered a lot of people within China who were very upset about these foreigners coming in, disrupting trade, and affecting their culture. Another very big rebellion as anger with the Qing dynasty increased within China was the Taiping Rebellion, which is a really, really long civil war that lasts 14 years in China. Hong Xiuquan was the leader of the Taiping Rebellion. He was the leader of the rebels. That's his picture there in the upper left. He had a vision that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and it was basically his calling to overthrow the Qing dynasty. And it was a very long, bloody war. For a while, Hong Xiuquan actually was able to control some land within China, but over time, with British help, the Chinese government ends up suppressing the rebellion, but not before 20 to 30 million people were killed in China in that 14-year period. You might be wondering about the lovely dish in the upper right there. That is General Cho's chicken, because General Cho was a famous Chinese general during the Taiping Rebellion. He's one of the ones who helped suppress the rebellion, actually. He was a general for the government, which is where the name of that lovely chicken dish actually comes from. I couldn't find a great picture of General Cho, so I found a picture of his namesake food. The Sino-Japanese War is later on. It's in 1894. Japan, not a big island country, beat the fool out of China in a very short war. And this was very, very humiliating for China because they see themselves as being incredibly powerful, and they're beaten by this tiny country. But as we've talked about in this class already, Japan had begun to modernize and had, a lot more technology at their disposal in this war. And you can see the difference between Chinese and Japanese culture if you look at that bottom picture. In the back, further away from the viewer in the picture, is the Japanese delegation at the treaty negotiations. And you can see they're wearing suits and Western-style clothing. And in the foreground, you see the Chinese delegation wearing traditional Chinese hats and robes. And that just is very illustrative of the difference in China and Japan as Japan began to modernize, and China was behind. So we're going to briefly pause talking about the wars and talk about trade a little bit. Foreigners tried to exploit China as they became weaker and weaker as a result of military defeats. And foreign countries began to carve out what was called spheres of influence, where they would essentially open up Chinese ports and then make negotiations and trade in those areas. And you can see a key here. This is actually around 1910, so it's a little bit later than what we're talking about right here. But you get the idea that different countries had different areas that they had trading rights in within China, and those areas are called spheres of influence. And a lot of Chinese people resented the foreign influence because they were so traditional and they didn't want their country to become modern and Western. They were very set in their ways. But that eventually, as you'll see, is going to have to change. The last major rebellion we're going to talk about is the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers are a society known as the Society of Righteous Harmonious Fists. And they're called the Boxers because of a style of martial arts they practiced which looked like boxing. And they launched a rebellion to push out the foreigners in 1899 because they were upset about the country being essentially divided up by these Western countries. And you see that frustration illustrated in the cartoon up there in the upper left, where you have from left to right there Queen Victoria of England, a German Kaiser, the Tsar of Russia, the representation of France is that woman there, and then someone from Japan carving up China while this Chinese man is helpless to stop it. As a result of that perceived helplessness and desire to keep China for the Chinese, the Boxers launch a big rebellion and start killing Christians and foreign merchants and missionaries in an attempt to protect the Qing dynasty and push out any outside influence. Eventually, the Boxers were stopped by an alliance of Western countries, including the United States. There was an alliance of 8 countries kind of put together by Japan, and the U.S. was part of that. But they eventually suppressed the Boxer Rebellion, but the damage sort of ends up being done. After the Boxer Rebellion, even the most conservative people in China begin to realize they're going to have to modernize like Japan had done because they can't keep up with these other countries anymore if they're going to remain a player on the world stage. And a lot of reformers begin to call for an end to the monarchy, wanting a more modern style of government. And eventually in 1911, a hodgepodge of peasants and warlords end up overthrowing the monarchy. And that's in 1911. Sun Yat-sen, whose picture is there, was U.S. educated, so he's very westernized and very modern, and he becomes the president of a new Chinese republic, and he is extremely nationalist and is going to work on modernizing China going forward. And we'll be talking about the effects of that in later units in this class. That is all for today. As always, be ready for a quiz and ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers!